Hello again, everybody. Welcome into Gamecock Central Radio. Emerson Phillips joined by Chris Clark talking about the Will Muschamp hire. The official announcement made yesterday that Will Muschamp is the new head coach of Gamecock football. And Chris, an eventful day yesterday for Coach Muschamp, formally introduced to Gamecock media and the Gamecock fan base, and then he got right to work recruiting. I thought it was very interesting how his day went yesterday. What can you tell us about it?
I mean, it was a whirlwind day. I mean, he spent time since he's been in Columbia just meeting with a lot of different people in different capacities, just taking in a lot of things about the job, getting suggestions, listening, giving his vision for the program. And I think a lot of people, from what I've heard, that have spoken with him since he's been on campus, been really impressed with him in that regard. And certainly he's ready to go to work. It was pretty evident. I think he was pretty antsy to get out of that press conference and finish up all the media opportunities so that he could get out, pound the pavement, and get on the road to recruiting. And he did that. I mean, immediately after his press conference, he's still in his suit and tie, which you don't really see coaches go around in suit and ties a ton. It does happen sometimes. But he was immediately at a high school, Richland Northeast, recruiting a linebacker there, T.J. Brunson, meeting with him, current Louisville commitment that they're looking at potentially flipping. So, and then he saw Brian Edwards last night. So he's definitely been hitting the road very hard, and recruiting's a big priority for him very early.
And he's known as a recruiter, Chris, and I like the fact that he got to work right away, literally drove straight from the presser over to Richland Northeast High School to meet with T.J. Brunson. And then last night he was in the home of Brian Edwards, the receiver from Conway, who had previously committed to South Carolina but kind of backed away from that once Spurrier resigned.
He did, yeah. And, Brian Edwards had a pretty good relationship with, of course, he committed to the previous staff. He had a good relationship with Steve Spurrier Jr. He was the receivers coach at South Carolina, of course. And, just some uncertainty. And it wasn't where he was completely closing the book on South Carolina. He's still considering them, still leaving it open. It sort of did open the door for Clemson to come in. He's still considering the Tigers as well. Taking his official visit this weekend, that'll be his last visit. And I think, people want to know where it stands with Edwards. It's still sort of a to be determined. It's going to depend on how his official visit goes this weekend, what he thinks of the new staff, what he thinks of the offense, and who South Carolina hires as a wide receivers coach. I think all those are going to be key factors as to whether or not South Carolina can get him back in the fold.
All right, let's talk about the staff for a moment. Chris, looks like Muschamp has brought in 3 assistants already, and there are sure to be more to follow, perhaps, starting today. Give us the 3 that have already been hired and talk about who else might be added this week.
Well, Sean Elliott will be retained, and that is, of course, pending him. He's been linked to the East Carolina job, which I think obviously if he was offered a head coaching job, he'd give that serious consideration and likely take it. I don't know what the chances are, but he is on the staff. He is retained. I think that was a good move by Muschamp because Elliott's really respected by the players and really respected by high school coaches in the state as well. The 3 outside coaches he hired have been Bobby Bentley, former Burns head coach, who was an analyst at Auburn on the offensive side of the ball. He'll be coaching running backs at South Carolina. Travaris Robinson, who's been with Muschamp at Florida and at Auburn, will be the defensive coordinator. He coached defensive backs at Florida and at Auburn under Muschamp. And then also Kurt Roper, who's been at Ole Miss and Duke and Tennessee, and he was with Muschamp at Florida in his final season. He'll be running the offense as the offensive coordinator. As for other names, there have been a lot of guys thrown out there, but it's just sort of unclear. We have, 3 different names for defensive line coach, and we've had Shane Beamer and Ellis Johnson thrown out and Lance Thompson, and it's sort of just unclear, what direction it's going to go, and Muschamp's not really in a rush with any of that stuff. But he does know that it's important to get the staff together for recruiting purposes, but you also got to get that staff right. So wants to make sure that, he can get the right guys on board when it can happen.
Chris Clark, Emerson Phillips with you here on Gamecock Central Radio. You can get breaking Gamecock news alerts delivered to your email inbox. Just text USC to 42828. Text USC to 42828 and get breaking Gamecock news alerts delivered to your email inbox. Chris, let's talk about a couple of other in-state prospects here. We talked briefly about T.J. Brunson, the Louisville commit, who is at Richland Northeast High. Sean Elliott with Coach Muschamp visiting T.J. Brunson at the school yesterday at Richland Northeast High School, and then Coach Muschamp went to Conway to visit in-home with Brian Edwards, the Conway Tiger standout. So immediately Muschamp went to work on those two, and there's another player in-state, John Simpson out of Fort Dorchester, big offensive lineman, 6'5", 290 pounds. He's got offers from everybody in the Southeast and beyond, and my understanding, Chris, is that he has narrowed his three to South Carolina, Clemson, and Alabama, and it seems like John Simpson, an immediate impact type of player, an SEC caliber lineman without question, and a guy that the Gamecocks would be very interested in getting.
Well, I think, Simpson's been a guy that's really been pegged to stay in state for a while, and I think South Carolina has been behind. Clemson has sort of been the front runner for a while. South Carolina has been up and down during the process. But with the new staff and with keeping Sean Elliott, that may give South Carolina a shot. He's taken his time. If they can land an official in January, then that's something to watch pretty heavily. I mean, he is a big fan of Sean Elliott. Sean Elliott's been the biggest reason that South Carolina was in it, and with the staff in flux and with that question out there of whether or not Elliott would return, I think that really sort of turned his attention away from South Carolina. But now with Elliott in the fold, he's, planning on giving South Carolina a pretty hard look. And so we'll see what happens if he can they can land an official in January after the dead period ends. I think that'd be huge and would give them a legitimate shot.
All right, Chris, a big weekend this coming up weekend for South Carolina recruiting. A number of recruits coming to campus for visits. I know Brian Edwards is scheduled. Brandon McElwain also scheduled to come in this weekend with many others. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, Brandon McElwain coming in. J.J. Givens will be there. Brian Edwards will be there. Could be other commitments that get scheduled up again. This is the last official visit weekend possibility before the dead period hits, which lasts for a month through about mid-January. And so the names will probably still get added to the list, and I'm sure there'll be guys that, are on the commitment list or some targets out there that will visit after the dead period ends sometime in January. But those guys I mentioned, Jamarcus King, a four-star junior college cornerback, will also visit this weekend, a guy that's familiar with Travaris Robinson and Muschamp because he was committed to Auburn for a time. So it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, it's a key weekend. We'll see if there are more staffers in place before the weekend because, again, a guy like Edwards is going to want to know. It's a key visit for McElwain to make sure he's completely comfortable with everything. It's going to be a big weekend, no doubt about it.
All right, Chris, so as best you can figure, what will Coach Muschamp's schedule look like this week?
Recruiting. I mean, that's the bottom line. He's going to be doing recruiting. I know he's going to see Brandon McElwain midweek. He's going to do that on Wednesday. I'm sure he'll be hitting the road to see other commitments and other targets. We don't know the schedule right now. When we do know, you can bet it'll be right on the Insiders Forum on GamecockCentral.com or maybe even on our front page. As soon as we confirm certain visits he's planning to take or visits that he has made, stops that he's made on the recruiting trail. But that's basically it. He's completely and totally focused on recruiting, which is definitely a good thing.
We've got free phone apps that allow you to listen to Gamecock Central Radio on your phone. iPhone app's available, and the Android app is out as well. We're also on iTunes. Simply search Gamecock Central Radio. Emerson Phillips with Chris Clark. And Chris, what about additional hires for the coaching staff? Is there a timeline for that? We've heard Brad Lawing. We've heard Ellis Johnson. What are the chances that these two, one or the other or both, is hired? And what's the chances there's an announcement this week?
Well, Muschamp said yesterday he's not setting a timetable on it, and that's wise. I mean, you've got to build the right staff, make sure you're getting the right guys, but at the same time, you're also balancing that with trying to get guys in for recruiting purposes. I mean, you need to have guys in on your staff that can recruit their players as soon as possible. I mean, every day is key. So, but it's also important not to rush it, and he's not going to rush it. He's got a few pieces out there. He's got some other irons in the fire, but nothing else confirmed. Mentioning Lawing and Johnson, I don't think Lawing is as likely right now, although, I mean, with coaching situations like this, circumstances can change, but I don't think it's as likely right now. Johnson seemed very likely early. I'm not sure as much now if it will be. The question would be, what would the role be? Obviously, South Carolina has a defensive coordinator, so would it be a position coach or something off the field? I'm just not sure. And so I think that'll bear itself out in the next several days.
Chris, has Coach Muschamp mentioned anything specifically about his plans for recruiting right away? Do you think he and Travaris Robinson and Bobby Bentley and these other staff members will concentrate more on players that have already been considering the Gamecocks, players that the Gamecocks have already been working on? Or do you think it's possible that Muschamp turned his attention to maybe some kids he was working on when he was at Auburn, or do you think maybe it'll be a combination of the two?
Combination. I mean, he's already said yesterday that he spent the night before watching, a lot of film on committed guys, and I'm sure some targets too, and just sort of assessing what the situation was. Of course, his first visit was to a guy that's not committed to South Carolina, and T.J. Brunson, and another guy who was committed to South Carolina, and Brian Edwards, and he'll see McElwain on Wednesday. So, I mean, it's a mixture of the two. You mentioned guys he recruited at Auburn. I don't know how many of those there will be, but Jamarcus King, the junior college cornerback I mentioned, was formerly committed to Auburn. And so obviously there's a familiarity there with him.
Chris, last year when Auburn hired Will Muschamp as its defensive coordinator, Auburn had a tremendous wave of momentum with recruiting. With the very next signing class, right after they hired Muschamp, they were able to get several kids to flip, and Muschamp made an immediate impact on Auburn's recruiting class right away. Is there reason to believe that the same type of effect could happen with South Carolina this year?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, does that mean they're going to go land a bunch of 4- and 5-star guys in this class? I don't know that. I mean, it's so early, and they are working against the clock in a way. But yeah, he was able to take some guys that really held him in high regard, and guys he recruited at Florida, and that really helped when there was that turnover with him taking T-Rob and him heading to Auburn. I mean, Byron Cowart, the number one prospect in the country, went to Auburn in very large part because of Muschamp. There were a few other Rivals 250 and Rivals 100 guys that were very familiar with Muschamp from the state of Florida that, even if he wasn't the lead recruiter for him at Auburn, took a harder look because of him going there. So there's reason to believe that, recruits' ears have been perked up a little bit because of Muschamp heading to Auburn, and I think it'll pay even bigger dividends down the road, but certainly there's been an uptick in interest even in this class.
All right, the coaching staff is being assembled and the recruiting process getting underway in earnest for this new South Carolina football coaching staff. Chris, I know you got a lot on your plate this week. We appreciate you taking time to join us here on Gamecock Central Radio.
Thanks a lot for having me.
All right, that's Chris Clark, and I'm Emerson Phillips, and we'll have plenty more on Gamecock football. The hire of Will Muschamp made official yesterday, and a busy time of year for Gamecock football fans. We got a lot of information coming for you here on Gamecock Central Radio. Thanks for joining us.